April 18, 1945. The Ruhr Pocket, Western Germany. More than 500,000 shattered soldiers, battle-hardened men who had fought from Stalingrad's ruins to Normandy's beaches, made a decision unthinkable only months earlier. They surrendered en masse to the advancing American armies, not after a climactic battle, not in a blaze of fanatic defiance, but quietly, collectively, decisively. What broke them wasn't simply superior firepower. It was something far more devastating, something invisible, methodical, and absolute. A new kind of warfare the Americans had refined to perfection, one that rendered resistance not only futile, but irrational. April 4th, 1945, 0600 hours, east bank of the Rhine River, Lippe sector. The encirclement was complete. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, stood in his makeshift headquarters, eyes fixed on maps that told an impossible story. In less than 2 weeks, American armored spearheads had achieved what German doctrine declared operationally impossible: the total entrapment of an entire army group. 325,000 combat troops, plus rear echelons, supply units, and stragglers. Over 430,000 men, sealed inside a pocket barely 50 miles wide. But it wasn't the scale that made history. It was what followed. The German army had been encircled before, at Stalingrad, at Falaise, at countless other fronts across Europe. Each time, the trapped forces fought with suicidal ferocity. But this time, there would be no desperate breakouts, no last stands, no doomed counterattacks.
Over the next 2 weeks, the largest mass surrender on the Western Front would unfold, quietly, efficiently, relentlessly. And it would expose something the German High Command feared more than any weapon. Their soldiers had stopped believing in the point of resistance. The Americans called their method vertical envelopment, a clinical phrase that masked a revolution in modern combat. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding 7th Corps, had perfected a system that didn't just defeat defenders, it made defending itself psychologically impossible. For years, the Wehrmacht had been told the Americans were soft, industrial soldiers who fought with machines, not with will. They were assured that German skill, discipline, and superior leadership would always triumph over material might. But within the Ruhr Pocket were men who had survived the horrors of Kursk and Kiev, veterans who knew how to fight in encirclement, men who had broken out before. And yet, within days, entire divisions were surrendering without firing a shot. By April 18th, when Model finally dissolved Army Group B and released his men from their oaths, over 317,000 had already laid down their arms. By the time the pocket was cleared on April 21st, American forces had processed 325,000 prisoners. 500,000 when counting Luftwaffe, SS, and paramilitary units scattered across the Ruhr Basin. What Germany faced was not an army, it was a system. A seamless, integrated machine that combined air power, armor, artillery, logistics, and psychological warfare into one overwhelming process. Each element reinforced the others, creating a cascade that made every hour of resistance more futile than the last. Model himself wrote in his final dispatch, "The Americans do not fight battles, they stage industrial operations. Our men face not an army, but a system. Courage means nothing when the enemy can anticipate your every move and render your position untenable before you occupy it." 3 weeks later, in the woods near Duisburg, Model ended his life. He left no note, only his aide recorded his final words. "A field marshal does not surrender, and I cannot ask my men to do what I will not." But his men had already chosen. Not out of cowardice, but out of clarity. They had realized a truth their commanders refused to see. The Americans had created a form of warfare where courage, skill, and determination no longer mattered. You could not outfight a system that calculated every move. You could not outmaneuver forces that saw every approach. You could not outlast an army whose lifeline stretched unbroken to an untouched industrial continent an ocean away. The story of the Ruhr Pocket is not a tale of battle. It is the moment industrial warfare reached its logical end, when one side's system made the other's struggle not just hopeless, but meaningless. 500,000 soldiers didn't surrender because they were beaten. They surrendered because they had become obsolete.
The German military doctrine that failed so catastrophically in April 1945 had been born out of triumph. For 5 years, the Wehrmacht had conquered a continent through principles that seemed invincible: speed, concentration of force, tactical flexibility, and the unmatched skill of its officers and men. Their concept, Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, gave commanders at every level a shared objective and the freedom to achieve it through initiative and instinct. A German lieutenant could react to battlefield changes faster than an American colonel could receive orders from headquarters. This decentralization allowed small German units to punch far above their weight, turning chaos into opportunity and setbacks into victories. From the Blitz across Poland to the collapse of France, from the Balkans to the gates of Moscow, this doctrine worked with terrifying precision. Every German soldier, from squad leader to staff officer, was trained to think independently. An infantry sergeant might carry more authority and more tactical understanding than an entire Allied platoon command team. It was a system that transformed skill and initiative into weapons more deadly than any tank or gun. Even as the tides of war turned, German tactical brilliance remained formidable. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, a handful of German veterans humiliated fresh American forces in their first major clash, exposing every weakness in Allied command and coordination. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, forced to reckon with the disaster, rewrote the entire foundation of American training and doctrine in its aftermath.
The lesson was clear. Raw courage and industrial output meant nothing if they couldn't outthink the enemy at the point of contact. The Americans had to change, fundamentally, or lose every time they met German veterans on equal ground. But Germany's strength was built on a fatal assumption. They believed wars would always be decided by tactical engagements, by brave men making brilliant choices under fire. They believed superior training and battlefield instinct would always compensate for the enemy's greater numbers and resources. They believed, in short, that the battlefield was still a contest of human skill. What they failed to grasp was that the Americans were no longer fighting battles. They were building a system. Between 1943 and 1945, the United States military underwent a metamorphosis without precedent in human history. It wasn't about creating better soldiers, it was about creating a self-sustaining war machine, a machine in which every element, men, metal, and movement, was synchronized with industrial precision. Individual heroism still existed, but it no longer decided outcomes. Strategy had evolved beyond courage. The new battlefield was not a duel, it was a process. By early 1945, the U.S. Army in Western Europe operated on a scale the Germans couldn't even imagine. Its logistical network delivered 26,000 tons of supplies a day. Each American division crossing the Rhine carried more artillery tonnage per hour than an entire German corps could fire in a day.
But numbers alone didn't break the German will. After all, the Soviets had fought with even greater material superiority on the Eastern Front, and still the Wehrmacht resisted with feral determination. At Budapest, they fought 50 days until annihilation. At Breslau, they held for 82 days, continuing even after Hitler's death. Against the Americans, that willpower evaporated. Why? Because the American war machine wasn't terrifying because of its firepower. It was terrifying because of its inevitability. The Germans called it Materialschlacht, the battle of material. But that phrase didn't capture its essence. The Americans had created a process where every German action triggered a perfectly calculated, overwhelming response. Artillery fire missions arrived within minutes. Airstrikes appeared within the hour. Armored columns cut off retreat routes before German officers even realized their positions were exposed. It wasn't prophecy. It was preparation. The Americans didn't need to predict the enemy. They simply had the resources to plan for every possible move simultaneously. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations for the German High Command, wrote in his diary that March, "Against the Americans, our doctrine has become a prison. Every principle that once served us now betrays us. Our flexibility means nothing when the enemy has a ready answer to every option. Our initiative is useless when each decision triggers annihilation. We fight an enemy who no longer needs to outthink us. He has made thinking irrelevant." But numbers alone didn't break the German will. After all, the Soviets had fought with even greater material superiority on the Eastern Front, and still the Wehrmacht resisted with feral determination. At Budapest, they fought 50 days until annihilation. At Breslau, they held for 82 days, continuing even after Hitler's death. Against the Americans, that willpower evaporated. Why? Because the American war machine wasn't terrifying because of its firepower. It was terrifying because of its inevitability. The Germans called it Materialschlacht, the battle of material. But that phrase didn't capture its essence. The Americans had created a process where every German action triggered a perfectly calculated, overwhelming response. Artillery fire missions arrived within minutes. Airstrikes appeared within the hour. Armored columns cut off retreat routes before German officers even realized their positions were exposed. It wasn't prophecy, it was preparation. The Americans didn't need to predict the enemy. They simply had the resources to plan for every possible move simultaneously. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations for the German High Command, wrote in his diary that March, "Against the Americans, our doctrine has become a prison. Every principle that once served us now betrays us. Our flexibility means nothing when the enemy has a ready answer to every option. Our initiative is useless when each decision triggers annihilation. We fight an enemy who no longer needs to outthink us. He has made thinking irrelevant."
This was the world into which Army Group B marched when American tanks crossed the Rhine. They brought experience, courage, and tactical mastery to a battlefield where none of it mattered anymore. They came prepared to fight a war. What they encountered instead was a system designed to make war itself impossible. The German defensive preparations in the Ruhr were meant to be their masterpiece, a fortress built from 5 years of brutal experience. Army Group B was not a rabble of broken men. It was a veteran formation, hardened by retreat and fueled by grim determination. Here, they would make their final stand. The 116th Panzer Division, battle-tested in Normandy. The 3rd Panzer Grenadier, survivors of Italy and France. The 338th Infantry Division, scarred veterans of the Eastern Front. These were not amateurs. They were the best Germany had left. General Gunther Blumentritt, commanding the 1st Parachute Army within the pocket, had spent the cold months of January and February turning the Ruhr into a fortress. His staff's planning papers, captured later by American intelligence, showed a chilling attention to detail. Every firing line had overlapping fields of fire. Every bridge was wired for demolition. Every crossroad had been pre-registered for artillery. Every possible American approach had been studied, mapped, and fortified. The terrain itself seemed to favor defense. The Ruhr Basin was an industrial labyrinth. Rivers, canals, rail lines, smokestacks, factories, and dense urban sprawl. Thousands of mines in industrial buildings created a natural fortress where every street corner could become a bunker, every factory a fortress. German engineers had spent months transforming this landscape into a killing ground, and they knew their enemy well. Captured intelligence files revealed German commanders understood the American advantages. They knew about U.S. artillery dominance and trained their troops to disperse the moment forward observers were spotted. They knew about American air power, planning operations only in poor weather when clouds could shield them. They knew American tank tactics and dug anti-tank positions in depth with layered fallback routes. They weren't ignorant, they were confident. Confident that even against overwhelming force, their doctrine would hold.
Their manuals for defensive warfare promised that a well-prepared position held by determined troops could bleed attackers at a ratio of 3 to 5 to 1. Even if the Americans came with triple the strength, the math seemed in Germany's favor. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein of 53rd Corps, a veteran of Africa, Normandy, and the Ardennes, summed up the faith of every German commander. The Americans will attack until their casualties become intolerable. Then they will stop. We only need to make the price too high. The terrain itself seemed to favor defense. The Ruhr Basin was an industrial labyrinth. Rivers, canals, rail lines, smokestacks, factories, and dense urban sprawl. Thousands of mines in industrial buildings created a natural fortress where every street corner could become a bunker, every factory a fortress. German engineers had spent months transforming this landscape into a killing ground, and they knew their enemy well. Captured intelligence files revealed German commanders understood the American advantages. They knew about U.S. artillery dominance and trained their troops to disperse the moment forward observers were spotted. They knew about American air power, planning operations only in poor weather when clouds could shield them. They knew American tank tactics and dug anti-tank positions in depth with layered fallback routes. They weren't ignorant, they were confident. Confident that even against overwhelming force, their doctrine would hold. Their manuals for defensive warfare promised that a well-prepared position held by determined troops could bleed attackers at a ratio of 3 to 5 to 1. Even if the Americans came with triple the strength, the math seemed in Germany's favor. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein of 53rd Corps, a veteran of Africa, Normandy, and the Ardennes, summed up the faith of every German commander. The Americans will attack until their casualties become intolerable. Then they will stop. We only need to make the price too high.
This doctrine had been forged in the crucible of Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group during the bitter winter of 1944. On his staff, Brigadier General Truman F. Anderson devised what he called the Red Ball System, a logistical and operational rhythm that fused intelligence, artillery, armor, air power, and supply into a single synchronized heartbeat. By April 5, 1945, 08:30 hours, the first full day of the encirclement, that system came alive. The Americans didn't just surround the Ruhr, they switched it on. American P-38 reconnaissance aircraft began flying grid patterns over the Ruhr at dawn. Their cameras, mounted beneath the wings, captured every road, bridge, and cluster of movement below, 12 images a second, hundreds of frames per minute. By midday, aerial photographs were being processed in mobile darkrooms and relayed to field command posts through the Signal Corps' wire network. Within hours, those photographs became overlays on operational maps at 1st and 9th Army headquarters. Each arrow, each marker, represented not a theory, but a verified position. Artillery, armor, or infantry, updated in near real time. The Americans weren't guessing where the Germans were, they knew. By late afternoon, these maps were fed into a continuous fire control cycle. Forward observers transmitted grid coordinates to Corps-level artillery liaison officers who entered them into portable plotting boards. The results were passed through switchboards to pre-registered batteries where gunners adjusted their range tables before the observers even called for fire. The delay between spotting a target and opening fire shrank to less than 2 minutes.
For the German defenders, this was the first sign that something unnatural was happening. Their movements were answered with immediate surgical artillery fire. A supply truck that paused too long at a crossroads was obliterated. An anti-tank gun that fired once was destroyed before it could reload. Every action triggered an equal and opposite response, instantaneous, precise, and devastating. At first, German commanders blamed spies or radio leaks. Counterintelligence units searched for hidden transmitters, arrested civilians, even executed suspected informants. But the strikes kept coming, mechanical, predictable, relentless. Every time they adapted, the pattern evolved faster. By April 7th, the system had reached full operational rhythm. American air reconnaissance fed data to artillery command, artillery cleared paths for armored spearheads, armor advanced only after logistics confirmed resupply routes were secured, and behind them, engineers rebuilt bridges before the ink dried on the orders authorizing the next assault. It was war conducted as an algorithm. Inside the Ruhr pocket, German reports began describing it in almost mystical terms. One officer wrote, "The enemy seems to know everything. They strike before we can react, move before we can plan, destroy before we can see." Another, captured near Essen, told his interrogators, "It is not soldiers we fight, it is a process. We shoot at one part and another takes its place. We retreat and they are already there." By April 8th, the collapse of command had begun. German field telephones were silent. Headquarters no longer received coherent reports, only fragments of panic. Divisions that existed on maps no longer existed in reality. Entire regiments vanished into industrial ruins, their survivors emerging days later, dazed and starving, unaware the front had already passed them by. American intelligence described it not as breakthrough, but disintegration. They didn't defeat German units, they simply ceased to function. Psychological warfare officers from SHAEF began broadcasting surrender instructions by loudspeaker and leaflet. What astonished them was how quickly the messages took hold. Even die-hard formations, paratroopers, Waffen-SS, Panzer Grenadiers began surrendering in groups, some still in formation, as if the act of resistance had simply been erased from their programming. In his final report before capture, General Blumentritt tried to explain what had happened. "We were prepared for a battle of endurance, not annihilation without contact. The Americans did not fight us, they rendered us irrelevant." By April 10th, the Ruhr was no longer a fortress. It was a graveyard of a system that believed war could still be mastered by courage, experience, and willpower. The Americans had shown that will alone no longer mattered. At 1340 hours, a final radio message was intercepted from the German 15th Army headquarters. "Command no longer possible. Units untraceable. Communications destroyed. Enemy everywhere." Then silence. The fortress had not fallen. It had simply ceased to exist. By April 12, 1945, the Ruhr pocket had ceased to be a battlefield. The front no longer had meaning. Maps no longer had lines. What remained was motion without direction, a broken landscape of surrendering men and silent machines. The German High Command in Berlin received conflicting messages. One report claimed Army Group B was holding firm. Another insisted it no longer existed. Both were true in their own way. For what remained of the Wehrmacht inside the pocket, reality had fractured. Battalions reported to divisions that no longer commanded them. Corps issued orders to units that had ceased to exist. Radio channels filled with static. Artillery officers begged for coordinates that no one could provide. And company commanders marched their men east, only to find the Americans already waiting there. It wasn't defeat in any recognizable sense. It was erasure. By April 14th, entire German columns were surrendering en masse. Some laid down arms at crossroads, others waved white cloths from factory rooftops. American officers stopped counting prisoners. There were too many. By the end of the week, over 317,000 men had fallen into Allied hands, one of the largest capitulations in human history. General Omar Bradley's headquarters at Wiesbaden logged the moment with bureaucratic precision. Enemy resistance terminated, administrative collection of prisoners in progress. But even in victory, there was unease. Eisenhower toured the Ruhr by jeep 3 days later, flanked by silent aides and photographers. What he saw disturbed him in a way no battlefield ever had. There were no decisive ruins, no dramatic last stands, only a kind of mechanical stillness. Shattered tanks parked neatly along roads, trucks abandoned mid-turn, rifles stacked beside ditches as if set down deliberately. The Germans had not been destroyed. They had simply stopped.
Standing before a valley filled with surrendered troops, Eisenhower reportedly said to Bradley, "We didn't defeat them, we just overwhelmed the idea of fighting." It was a realization that transcended strategy. The Americans had not just won a war, they had changed what war was. The Ruhr campaign was the first true demonstration of a principle that would define every conflict to come: the automation of victory. The fusion of information, logistics, and destruction into a seamless process that no human mind could fully comprehend, let alone resist. In a report written weeks later, Colonel Truman F. Anderson, the architect of synchronized operations, described it in words that bordered on prophecy. Future warfare will not be fought by men, but by systems. The side that wields the faster, more adaptive system will prevail, not through courage, but through tempo. The Germans had entered the Ruhr believing they were fighting an army. They discovered they were fighting time itself, an enemy that no weapon could slow. When the Ruhr finally fell silent, the Americans didn't celebrate. They just kept moving. Their columns rolling east, their machines refueling, their process resuming, as if victory itself was only another scheduled phase of operation. And behind them, in the ruins of the industrial heart of Germany, the last defenders of the old world realized the truth. The age of the soldier was over. War had become something else, something beyond valor, beyond chaos, beyond humanity. A system, vast, relentless, and cold, that would shape the future not through battle,